Regarding Gandhi, or Mahatma Gandhi from India, who had a great impact upon the world, you might say for peace, you might say for humanity. He removed, so to speak, certain domination by the British Empire upon the Indian peoples. And he also impacted greatly some of the most profound writers around the same time, as well as other leaders in general. Perhaps Martin Luther King was impacted by him, Tolstoy, and others. So it is touted, for instance, that he was practicing nonviolence. But what does that mean? For instance, there are others who say they are pacifists or conscientious objectors, say, and will not participate in any form of aggression or activity, shall we say, also on behalf of certain enterprises or causes. There are others, say the Mennonites, who say they would rather die, and their families, than to do such and such. This may be also attributed in part to, say, the Quakers. But of course, then there's also the question of who is going to protect something or another of their lives, their rights, so to speak, in the country, if not themselves. If that isn't addressed, there's quite a disconnect there, I think. Even Albert Einstein, the physicist who developed the theory of relativity, and, say, the British during World War II, both for a time might have been called pacifists and thought perhaps that they could simply talk Hitler out of his intentions with mere words. But rather like trying to discuss things with words with an addict, say, and perhaps my thinking these days is that Hitler was a consummate addict, but not in terms of chemical substances, that you're not going to get very far discussing things with words with an addict unless you have sufficient leverage. So the question then being, what kind of leverage do we have against certain people if we want something and they want something else? And in this case, for Gandhi, what leverage did he have? Was he exercising any leverage or abdicating it completely when he said he was practicing nonviolence, for instance? Is that burying your head in the sand and walking away? Perhaps like the Mennonites have been said to do in some circles. I believe now, at this point in my life, that there are two types of what we shall call violence, or aggression or exertion, physical and emotional. Or maybe to clarify, by emotional, I mean the impact of our words or nonverbal communications. And so you can have, quote, violence of a physical nature that impacts someone else's body, or maybe, shall we say, threatens to do so through what you might call saber rattling. Or one can impact someone heavily by our words in the sense that we injure their self-esteem, and secondly, it's not very easy for them to repair this, because it's not very easy to change how they were impacted without changing the words they heard. And the words they heard tend to be, almost without exception in the people area, built into a dictionary. And you either rip those words out of the dictionary and create your own, or you're stuck with them. And so these words can be a form of weaponry for violence against the self-esteem, or call it ego, of somebody else. Hence the phrase, I believe quite inaccurate, saying sticks and stones, or shall we say guns, bombs, what have you, physical violence or aggression can break my bones, but words can never hurt me. I believe words can hurt far more because the effects are far less repairable, far less copable with than maiming and even death of a loved one due to physical-based violence. That doesn't affect our self-esteem, nor does it affect our thinking then, how we process it, so to speak. We thus can learn to deal with being physically maimed far easier than being emotionally maimed, as per our self-esteem injured by words that we can't deprogram, deneuter, what have you, or invent new ones also in their place. So when it is said that Gandhi practiced nonviolence, I believe he was practicing the matter of not being violent emotionally as per injuring self-esteem as a tool on the battlefield of life, so to speak, in this case with the British toward the end years of his life. Now, on the other hand, maybe Gandhi would have used physical violence if he had tools, weaponry, and numbers of them, including the populace, that outgunned, in this case, the British. And that's what the Americans, the Allies, tried to do basically with Hitler. But Gandhi knew right off the bat that the weaponry, so to speak, the tools of the Indian peoples were far insufficient to the clout of the British. Kind of like the David and Goliath story, or trying to take down City Hall with a pea shooter, so to speak. Hence the idea also, when said, you can't fight City Hall, well, I suppose you can't fight an enemy if outgunned, markedly so, unless you have a leg up in some department, some other form of leverage that's quite unconventional. So I believe that's where Gandhi won the arena, so to speak. He used weaponry, strategy of a sort, call it what you will, that was very unconventional and different than the British had. And while you could say this was practicing nonviolence, he was actually, I believe, practicing a form of warfare that entailed both not using physical violence through weaponry of a conventional nature, but secondly, a special form of warfare called, you might say, holding a mirror in front of the British or anyone else, such that their self-esteem was heavily impacted when they saw who they actually were, their nature, their character, their motives. In other words, Gandhi's form of weaponry actually was a mirror held up in the face of whomever, toward the end years of his life, the British. That was his weaponry of choice. And it was not injurious upon the British as per use of words that could not be undone, so to speak, very easily. Now, I would further say that while this may have stung tremendously in the face of the British or anyone else up against Gandhi, it was not of the sort that used words that were then not easily deprogrammable. Gandhi was not saying, for instance, you chose to be who you were, nor was he basically saying, I understand why you are as you are. He was simply saying, this is who you are through a mirror held up to them. Kind of like saying, this is your character, without saying they chose that character, or this is the prognosis of your character. He was simply saying, this is your character at present. Upon which nobody almost could stand seeing who they really were, and had a choice here then, either flee or change. Now, of course, then, part of the battle then between Gandhi versus the British was a war of tit for tat, or rather, I should say, interchanges, upon which Gandhi was repeatedly assaulted with insults, with physical violence, and his counter-response was not to give the same to them in terms of what you shall call insults, disrespect, words that were inaccurate thus. He did not insult the British when they basically insulted him in a variety of ways. And thus, this was the mirror he held up to them, showing them their character, showing them through a mirror of non-responsiveness in kind who they really were. That was his weapon then, his mirror. Now, there is a woman who is from India originally, and a psychologist, Dr. Ramani, who speaks extensively on the topic of narcissism. I'm not a fan of using that term, but at any rate, she discusses as part of this phenomenon, shall we say, baiting. She discusses how some people try to bait other people to provoke them. Now, some might say, some try to provoke you to violence of a physical nature, a counter-response like punching back, hitting. But there is another form, to provoke someone to insult someone as a form of weaponry and self-defense. And so this baiting she talks of, and some others have talked of too, being an attempt, I believe, largely to protect yourself, to counter-respond through the use of insults, upon which then the other person says, I won. Look at the other person. They're not the person they're claiming to be, loving, kind, empathetic. And so I won the battle. They're a fraud. So you might say then, Gandhi won the battle in the end by not succumbing in significant degree, if at all, to the baiting, to the insults. He did not give it back in kind, and thus demonstrated through a mirror effect, I would say, who other people actually were, namely the British, or some of them, particularly in the upper hierarchy of leadership. And the reason this was so impactful is because I believe our nature as human beings almost inevitably is to want to believe we are kind, loving, empathetic people. Same for the British. Only, you might say, their left hand didn't know what their right hand was doing. They claimed to be empathetic, kind, loving people in certain areas of their leadership particularly, but it wasn't true to a great degree. And so there was a great disconnect here, and Gandhi, through his non-responsiveness, you might say, in that regard, through his not throwing back in their face in kind through insults, was holding a mirror showing there was a great disconnect, a great lack of walking the talk, shall we say, between their craving on a conscious level to believe they are kind, loving, empathetic people, what have you, and who they actually were, which was much more buried in what you might call an unconscious or presently unaware fashion. In like mind, some, such as Gore Vidal, to a certain degree of efficiency or not, was said to be a thorn in the side of the establishment. And Tolstoy from Russia was also said to be this kind of a thorn in terms of disturbing the consciousness, or rather the conscience of certain leadership in Russia, including the Tsar, I suppose. To the extent he was considered basically the unofficial alternate Tsar of Russia in time. And upon his death, mass numbers came out to his funeral, for instance. Tolstoy then also practicing what you might say nonviolence. I'm not of the belief that he was doing it as well as Gandhi did, but he was trying to an extent to do so through non-insults to a degree that he was capable of in response to certain elements leading Russia at that time. So, to recap, to say somebody, in this case Gandhi, Tolstoy, whomever, was practicing nonviolence, I do not believe means that they had walked away from a fight, a battle, a struggle. Quite the opposite. I believe in this circumstance, outgunned in terms of weaponry, they had no other option, and maybe weaponry typically isn't best options anyway in the long run. Maybe the best weaponry is this nonviolence approach of giving respect no matter what given to you, this being then the weapon of a mirror held in the face of the other person, showing the disconnect between their claim to be loving, empathetic, kind people versus who they really are, at least at present, and hopefully changeable. I'll close with a quote said by leadership of higher levels to those underneath in lower levels in Britain at that time about Gandhi. They had said, "Don't get near Gandhi, he'll get to you." You might alternatively say, maybe from the 1960s, I'm trying to remember the phrase, that love conquers all. Well, perhaps we might say, to refine that a bit, I think, that respect, that not giving back in kind for insults handed you is very, very powerful, but very hard to pull off. If we are outgunned physically, so to speak, or outgunned with weaponry of a conventional nature, many of us would tend to want to use the weaponry of insults as a tool. And unfortunately then, that doesn't seem to come out very well. The person thus who is what you call unbaitable in this sense, who does not hand back disrespect when given it, either with words or nonverbal communications, intonation of the voice, facial gestures, eye movements, so on and so forth. Perhaps even, to an extent, sheer avoidance, as if I'm too good for you, communicated, again, a sign of disrespect. Well, that's quite a form, quite hard to cope with, to combat, at least in the long run. And why it was again said of Gandhi don't get near him. Basically, he will change you. He has a force there that is almost unstoppable, at least in time. One last thought. There is a wonderful little 15-minute or so video on YouTube entitled Validation. And there was a man working in a parking garage who gained quite a bit of notoriety for being very uplifting to people, to the extent they would come over and over to the parking garage simply to have their, quote, ticket validated, but moreover, their assets of a personal nature validated. In other words, encouraged, uplifted. Now, I believe in Gandhi's sense, he was practicing a form of uplifting to the extent of not insulting people when insulted. Not really a matter of validating someone's strengths, but not giving back in kind what was given to him, such that a mirror was held up to the other person. They had a great quandary then, when faced with a mirror showing who they really were versus who they wanted to be and think they were. Either flee the mirror, so to speak, or change. Hence again, once again, the phrase, don't get near Gandhi. I forget the exact wording, but he will get to you, I believe was the exact words. He will change you. He will force you to feel such pain of the cognitive dissonance between claiming to be loving, kind, empathetic, so on, versus who you really are. You'll have to either flee that mirror, him, or change, if you want to continue to maintain your loving, kind, empathetic. Now, of course, for the very rare bird, I'm not sure there are any of them who simply says, well, I never wanted to be loving, kind, empathetic, and I could care less about being so. Well, then I don't think this weapon could work. That might have been the case of Hitler to some extent, I'm not sure. I would say, though, the Americans, the Allies, did not practice what Gandhi did, and so that would not, of course, even have been an option for him changing. We were not capable as a whole of doing this. America as a whole was not Gandhi. There probably was not even, or if rarely, a single soldier as a whole that was of the same as Gandhi. And so weaponry of a conventional nature was used instead. Gandhi was thus a very rare bird, and some others have tried to approximate him to degrees, Martin Luther King, Tolstoy, and some others. But I don't believe they came to the gold standard of Gandhi in this respect. And, of course, Gandhi himself was only a man. He probably had his fallibilities in terms of doing this at a 100% level and at 100% of the time. But I do believe he pulled off something that was quite rare. And to call it nonviolence misses the mark, I think, in terms of seeing what really he was doing. He was using an alternate form of weaponry, once again, I believe. It was a weaponry of a simple mirror through his non-responsiveness in terms of insulting others as a weapon. That was not pacifism, thus, in that sense. It was not walking away, and it was not doing nothing. And it was very strategic to get to the point where he could even do this. He was, of course, a lawyer, and perhaps not a very good one at first, but he developed. Just like Abe Lincoln, a former president, naturally, in the United States, was a horrendous businessman and not a good lawyer at first. But he developed. He developed until at a point in time he rarely lost a case. Now, I don't believe Lincoln was a saint, but at any rate, he developed and honed his skills with people to a marked degree. Some would say anyway, at least in certain venues. My thoughts then on Gandhi and this so-called nonviolent approach.